This is the Telegraph's Deputy Comment Editor, Annabel Denham. This and a few more stories, Annabel. Good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon.
Good to see you. They always talk about rabbits out of hats. I hate that phrase, by the way. It's never really a rabbit, of course. But it's a metaphor for the big idea. Is there going to be one tomorrow?
Well, what's so strange about what's happened this week is that we've almost had the rabbits preemptively. We had Rishi Sunak standing up and giving his speech yesterday, setting out perhaps what some of the tax cuts might be coming down the line in the autumn statement. So he's rather stolen a march on his own Chancellor in terms of what we can perhaps expect: a raising of the inheritance tax thresholds, possibly a lowering of the amounts. There's an expectation from businesses that full expensing will be made permanent. That's a very popular tweak to our tax system among businesses. Now, I'd like to see, of course, Jeremy Hunt go a bit further. I think he ought to abolish inheritance tax altogether. I find it a grotesque, immoral tax, and it's actually widely quite unpopular. In terms of business taxation, well, perhaps there's something that could be done around business rates that make it very difficult for high street retailers to compete with those operating solely online. I'd like to see a reduction in corporation tax, but of course that's quite unlikely when it was only hiked at the budget this year. But of course there's a strange narrative coming out now, isn't there, Ian, where for a long time we've heard Rishi and Jeremy Hunt say that they can't cut taxes, that they've got to bring inflation down, that the economy simply isn't in a fit enough state for them to do so. They haven't got ample fiscal headroom. Now they've really changed their tune, and that's for two reasons. The first is essentially they've squeezed the middle classes so much that tax receipts have gone up, giving them that fiscal headroom, but also a terribly bruising week for the Conservative Party last week, with Rishi sacking Suella Braverman, who was popular among some of those on the right of the party as well as the grassroots. So I think that's made him very unpopular, but also losing the Rwanda case has been very painful for the Conservative government. So they're just trying to claw back some of the members, some of the voters as well, that they may have lost.
Apparently Mr Hunt is borrowing less than ever, we understand. 17 billion less is the current forecast this year. So that would be seen as a good thing. But, I mean, they're still borrowing eye-watering amounts of money.
They are, indeed. And, of course, very little said on the other side of the ledger beyond welfare reform, which is how much the government is spending. When is it going to take an axe to some of our public services? When is it going to have a fundamental rethink about whether there are areas of our society and our economy that the government doesn't need to be involved in? So, for instance, I've written a lot about childcare. It's my view that until the 1990s, this was charitable and philanthropic. And ever since then, the government has just been more and more involved, to the extent that it's now spending around £6 billion a year on the sector. And I'm not sure that over that 30-year period, anybody has stopped to think about why the government is involved in childcare, what the state is actually trying to achieve, and whether that money could be better spent elsewhere. And there are a lot of examples like that, where the government could actually be quite bold and quite radical, in addition to the very welcome welfare reforms that we're expecting to be announced in tomorrow's statement.
Indeed. Let's move to another big story. Chris Whitty giving evidence in the latest instalment, of course, of the COVID inquiry. Let's have a look at what he's been saying.
I did have a stronger concern, I would say, than some, that the biggest impacts of everything we did, and I was confident we were going to have to do them, to be clear, but when we started, the disadvantages of all the actions, not just full lockdown, but other actions before that, for example, what was initially called cocooning and then shielding, as an example, stopping schooling is another. The biggest impacts of those would be in areas of deprivation and those in difficulties and those living alone and so on.
He always looks like a man who really doesn't want to be there, Annabel, doesn't he? He looks very uncomfortable. I think he's probably quite shy, we know that. But, I mean, this is the latest. Yesterday it was his former cohort, Valence, that was there, the chief science advisor. Today it's Chris Whitty. Is this going to come to anything, this thing?
Well, what's interesting about what Chris Whitty has said thus far is the suggestion that he was considering things a bit more in the round, whereas Patrick Vallance was quite clear that he was looking at the science, and of course we then had the government insisting that it was following the science, whereas there seems to be some acceptance there from Chris Whitty that he was considering the economic impacts, the impacts on those from underprivileged households. And of course, throughout the pandemic, there was always a concern that the government was so fixated on preventing anybody from dying from COVID that it's made so many sacrifices elsewhere. And a question that we should have asked then and we continue to ask now is why weren't economists consulted more? Why wasn't there an opportunity to talk about the economic impact of shuttering the economy for the best part of 2 years, the consequences of which are being felt now?
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting that, Valence made that point that there wasn't a, they apparently they had one meeting or something where some people who knew stuff about money and the economy pitched up and they all had a bit of a chat and they never had a meeting again after that. And that was kind of it. And of course, as if that was a sort of an irrelevance. And of course, human health and saving lives is, you have to be a fool not to understand the importance of that. But the idea that, tanking your economy wasn't a consideration is incredible.
And there's obviously the social impacts as well, Ian. The fact that children weren't able to go to school. And it's not just about getting an education. It's about interacting with their friends and their teachers and extracurricular. And we know now that this has created ultimately a mental health crisis among a lot of young people. There's a massive increase in the number of teenagers who are getting eating disorders, for instance. There's been an increase in depression and anxiety. And none of this is altogether surprising, as well as you say, the economic impact and the health impact. We have a healthcare service that's got 7.8 million people on the backlog, and it's really struggling to clear that. And all of this is a hangover from the decisions that were made during the coronavirus pandemic. And one concern I have from the inquiry is that it's not really asking the right questions. There should be one question it ought to be trying to answer above all else, which was the lockdown worth it? Was the cure actually worse than a disease? And it seems to me as though Baroness Hallett and those who are in charge of the inquiry have already decided that lockdown was the right measure, and they're just trying to establish why it wasn't introduced sooner, why it didn't last for longer, why perhaps we didn't have more lockdown.
It does feel that way. And when you consider, we had a virologist on with us yesterday who would say, well, actually, it was the lockdown was all about saving the health service rather than us catching it, so we didn't have this bottleneck. But of course, in having the lockdown, we've created a huge bottleneck now. So we've got this waiting list that we could never have imagined would be there a few years ago.
And it's absolutely enormous. And of course, that will be very punishing for the Tories. Let's not forget Rishi Sunak. He stood up in January and he set out his 5 pledges for the country, which could be boiled down to 3, really. He wanted to stop the boats, he wanted to fix the NHS, and he wanted to sort out the economy. And the economy, we're stagnating, as according to the latest GDP data. He's failed to stop the boats. And now we've got this massive backlog on the NHS. So, and of course, yesterday, what really struck me was we had these new promises from Rishi Sunak, which perhaps supersede the 5 pledges. It's not altogether clear, but the NHS wasn't on there. So is that an implicit admission from the government that it can't actually reduce the waiting list?
We can't do anything about that. Very briefly, Annabel, net migration. It was only about a month ago. We all looked at this figure of, 600,000 net migration. Wow, really? Now we're told it could reach 700,000. This is out of control, right?
I think it's felt out of control for quite a long time now. Let's not forget that in the 2010s we had Theresa May coming out and saying she wanted to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands. Well, we're a long, long way off that. And while we spend a lot of time talking about and worrying about illegal migration, specifically people crossing the channel in boats, actually it's the legal migration figure that is just soaring. And of course that's a net figure, the 606,000. Over 1 million people were coming to this country last year.
Is that sustainable over many years? Probably not. Listen, Annabel, good to see you. Thank you.